"Embarrass us," my grandson whispered, his voice sharp as a knife pressed against my chest. The words came not in anger but in quiet urgency, as though my very presence was a risk, a burden he could no longer carry. The hall glowed with chandeliers, polished marble floors reflecting the light of the season, families dressed in their finest clothes. Yet all I could feel was the sting of those 4 words, whispered not with love but with fear, fear of being seen with me. The night was supposed to be one of celebration, a winter's gala, the kind where every family arrived with pride, ready to clap for their own, ready to be noticed. I had been invited not by choice but out of obligation. They couldn't leave me behind, not on a night where appearances mattered so much. Still, they seated me at the far end of the row, away from the cameras, away from the important eyes. I was hidden in plain sight, as though my silence was the only thing they wanted from me. His whispers still echoed in my ear as the room filled with voices. "Don't embarrass us." He did not mean it as a plea. It was a command, a cage built around me. I lowered my eyes to my worn hands, veins raised against thin skin, hands that had built homes, fixed broken roofs, planted gardens, and carried burdens heavier than the young boy beside me could ever imagine. And yet to him, I was just an old man who could ruin the perfect picture of their evening. My heart ached not from the whisper itself, but from its meaning. Somewhere along the way, the sacrifices I made, the nights I worked while others slept, the hours I gave to raise them, all of it had been forgotten, buried under their desire for status, for acceptance in the eyes of strangers. They did not see me as the man who had given them a foundation to stand on. They saw me as a shadow, one that might darken their shine. The lights dimmed as the program began. Voices hushed. The mayor's assistant stepped forward with a folder of names. Pride filled the air like perfume, thick and suffocating. Mothers straightened their children's collars. Fathers leaned back with smug smiles. Families waited for recognition. My own family sat taller in their seats, eager to bask in any connection to importance. And there I was, with my grandson still watching me out of the corner of his eye, making sure I did not stand, did not speak, did not exist beyond the whisper he had given me. I could have spoken then. I could have leaned back and reminded him of every sacrifice, every brick I laid, every meal I skipped, so his father, my son, could eat. But I didn't. I held the words behind my lips, letting the silence grow heavier than any protest. For silence has a way of echoing louder than voices when the truth waits beneath it. And yet, even as I sat there, tucked in the shadows, forgotten by the blood I had once carried in my arms, a part of me stirred. Something deep, something unshaken. I was not here by accident. The night would not end in whispers. For no grandson's fear, no family's shame could erase what I had given, what I had built. And though I could not see it yet, though my family would have given anything for me to remain invisible, the truth was already making its way to the surface. The stage was waiting. The silence was preparing to break. And the words that had cut me tonight, "Don't embarrass us," would one day return to haunt him, to shame not me, but those who had whispered them. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever faced something similar in your life? Don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep telling these stories. Now, let's continue. He sat at the end of the row, his chair pushed just far enough into the shadows that it seemed deliberate, as if someone had decided that was the safest place for him. Not too close to be noticed, not too far to raise questions. The others in his family leaned forward in their seats, their faces glowing with excitement under the chandeliers. Their laughter rang out easily, sharp and polished, meant to be heard by those around them. But when their eyes drifted back toward him, the warmth vanished. Each glance carried the same weight, impatience, discomfort, a silent plea for him to remain invisible. He folded his hands in his lap, the knuckles swollen and rough from decades of work that no one here wanted to remember. His suit was not new, but pressed carefully. His shoes shined, though they carried the scuffs of years. He had taken care, as he always had, but in their eyes he was still too much, too little, too wrong. To them, his presence was not an honor. It was a burden they had been forced to drag along. As he sat in that half-light, memories stirred uninvited. He remembered when those same eyes, his sons, his daughter-in-laws, even his grandsons, once looked at him with awe. They had tugged at his sleeve, asking him to tell stories, to fix toys, to explain the world in the way only a father and grandfather could. Back then, his words carried weight. His silence carried peace. His presence meant safety. But now, those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime, one that had been quietly erased and replaced with shame. Around him, the murmur of the crowd rose and fell like the tide. Names were whispered, connections discussed, promises of favors exchanged. Pride was traded like currency in that hall, and every family guarded their reputation as though it were more valuable than love itself. His own family sat straighter when someone important walked by, their smiles wide and eager, their voices suddenly bright with pride. But when his name was mentioned, if it was mentioned at all, their faces tightened, their lips pressed thin, as though his story were an inconvenience best forgotten. The ache in his chest grew heavier with each stolen glance. He was not foolish. He understood what they wanted from him tonight. They wanted silence. They wanted stillness. They wanted the comfort of saying they had honored him by bringing him along, while quietly ensuring he would remain unseen. To them, he was a relic of another time, something too worn to display, too inconvenient to celebrate. And yet, in that quiet seat at the edge of the row, his heart held a dignity no whisper could take. He had built too much, sacrificed too much, to be erased by glances of impatience. He sat tall despite the shadows, his silence not weakness but strength, the kind of strength that endures long after applause fades. And though they did not know it, though they would have given anything to keep him tucked away, the night would not end as they had planned. For the shadows often hold the brightest truths, waiting for the moment to step into the light. Wrinkled hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of years carried too long without recognition. The skin was thin, marked with lines carved by decades of labor, by nights spent working when others slept, by mornings when he rose before the sun to provide for those who now sat taller than him, pretending he was barely there. His back had bent under the gravity of time, his shoulders rounded by the silent toll of responsibility, yet inside him the flame had not dimmed. His spirit, though battered, still burned quietly, with the same steady strength that had once built their world. To the strangers in the hall, he might have looked like any other old man, one more face in a crowd of families dressed in their finest, a figure softened by age and destined for silence. But to those who bore his name, those who carried his blood, he was something else entirely, a reminder of roots they wished to deny, of sacrifices they refused to recall, of debts they would rather forget. They tolerated his presence as one might tolerate the weight of an old coat on the back of a chair. Necessary, perhaps, but unwelcome when the room was meant to shine. The whispers stung more than the ache in his bones. He had grown used to pain, the kind that lodged itself in his knees, the sharp twinge that flared when he stood too quickly, the soreness in his shoulders that never fully faded. Pain of the body was familiar, expected, survivable, but the hushed voices, the dismissive glances, the careful avoidance of his name, those pierced deeper than any physical wound. His son's quick corrections, his daughter-in-law's tight smile, his grandson's fearful whisper, all of it pressed against him heavier than the years themselves. He sat silently, remembering a time when things had been different, when those same children, now grown, once clung to his hand with trust, when his voice, deep and certain, had been the one they ran to, when every problem was solved with his presence, when his wisdom was sought, when his stories lit up their eyes. But somewhere between then and now, the years had blurred his worth into something they could no longer see. What had once been pride had been twisted into shame. The irony was bitter. The very hands that they now dismissed as frail had once carried the beams of houses, mended broken fences, lifted them from the ground when they fell. The very voice they now wished to silence had once been the guiding compass of their lives. And the very back they now mocked as bent had once borne the weight of their comfort, their safety, their futures. He breathed slowly, forcing the ache back into its place. He would not let it show. His dignity was not theirs to decide, not theirs to measure. Though they saw only an old man, tolerated and hidden, he knew the truth of who he was, and that truth would not stay buried. He sat at the edge of their pride, in the dimmest corner of their evening, holding inside him the one thing they had forgotten. That legacy does not bend with the body, nor fade with age. It waits, patient and unshaken, for the moment it will be seen again. As the program began and polite applause rippled across the hall, his mind drifted far from the polished stage and the shining decorations. He did not see the banners or hear the speeches. Instead, he saw nights, endless nights where his body worked until it had nothing left to give. Nights when he labored under dim lamps, his hands blistered, sweat dripping into the soil, into the iron, into the wood, into whatever job would pay enough to keep food on the table. Those nights had built the foundation of this family. They had been the quiet currency of love, traded silently for his children's futures. He remembered slipping money into envelopes, never mentioning the extra hours he had worked to fill them. He remembered coming home late, his clothes carrying the scent of steel and earth, while his children slept soundly in warm beds he had earned for them. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out like battle plans, calculating carefully what could be spared, what must be saved, how much he could put away for their schooling, their weddings, their dreams. All those sacrifices, every coin of sweat and drop of time, had been given without expectation of applause. He never wanted recognition. He only wanted them to have more, to carry lighter burdens than he had. Yet now, sitting among them in the glow of chandeliers, he realized those gifts had not simply been forgotten, they had been erased. His silence, once his strength, had become his condemnation. To them, his sacrifices were invisible, buried under the arrogance of their present pride. The memories pressed harder. He recalled the mornings when his back screamed in protest, but he forced himself upright, because children needed breakfast, and work could not wait. He remembered fixing the roof in the rain, patching shoes with trembling fingers, giving away his own coat on freezing days so his son could be warm. None of these moments had been dramatic or public, but they had been the unseen pillars holding the family upright. And yet, here he was, treated as though his very presence threatened to topple the illusion of their success. Every whispered dismissal, every impatient glance in the hall tonight was like a cruel rewriting of history, as if his years had amounted to nothing more than inconvenience. They saw his age, his slowness, his bent shoulders, and not the decades that carved them. They saw burden where there had once been sacrifice, embarrassment where there had once been love. A deep heaviness settled in his chest, not of regret but of sorrow. Not for himself. He had lived with dignity, even in silence. The sorrow was for them, for what they had lost without even realizing it. They had traded memory for arrogance, gratitude for shame. They had built a fragile pride on foundations they pretended were theirs alone, never acknowledging the unseen hands that had carried them here. And as he sat there, half hidden in the shadows of the row, he understood something that cut sharper than all the whispers. Love unrecognized is not love lost. It waits silently, like truth. And truth, no matter how deeply buried under arrogance, will one day rise. Names were called, one after another, each syllable polished like a jewel, each announcement greeted with thunderous applause. The hall swelled with pride, voices rising, hands clapping as the mayor spoke of young achievers, entrepreneurs, community leaders. Every name seemed to carry weight, as though it were a crown placed upon someone's head. Families leaned forward with smiles that stretched wide, their pride measured not in humility but in how loudly they could applaud. His own family was no different. They clapped eagerly, leaning toward the stage as though proximity alone tied them to greatness. Their hands struck together with more enthusiasm for strangers than they had ever offered him. He watched them carefully, watched how their faces lit up for others, how their eyes glistened at the accomplishments of people they barely knew. Their excitement was sharp, exaggerated, almost desperate, and yet not once did they glance his way. Not once did they allow their pride to extend toward the man seated at the end of the row. To them, he was a fixture, a ghost pressed into a chair, present but invisible. He sat still, his palms resting on his knees, absorbing the scene in silence. The ache in his chest pulsed with every burst of applause. He was not envious of the names being called. He had lived long enough to know what recognition meant and what it cost. What hurt was not the absence of his name, but the absence of their memory. They clapped for men and women who had given speeches, donated checks, opened businesses. They forgot the man who had given his life to them quietly, without stages or microphones, without the world's applause. In that silence, he felt the cruel irony. Applause for strangers was easier than gratitude for blood. His son's hands stung red from clapping. His daughter-in-law leaned forward with gleaming eyes. His grandson shifted with excitement for achievements that did not belong to them. And yet, for the man who had built their roof, who had carried their burdens, who had sacrificed his own dreams for theirs, there was only impatience, only avoidance, only the lingering fear that he might embarrass them if he dared to exist too boldly. The stage glittered, each honoree walking proudly to the front, their names repeated, their legacies celebrated. He did not begrudge them their moment. Every life has its victories. But he knew in his heart that some victories are quieter, harder, deeper, measured not in applause but in survival, in sacrifice, in endurance. His victories lived in his children's education, in the warm beds they had slept in the meals they had eaten without hunger gnawing at them. Victories no one clapped for, but victories nonetheless. And as the mayor continued to call names, the old man felt a strange calm settle inside him. He had lived his life in the shadows of such stages, never needing lights or recognition. But tonight, as his family leaned forward, forgetting him, silencing him, erasing him, tonight was not over. Pride, he knew, is a fragile crown, and truth has a way of breaking through when it is least expected. The stage that now ignored him would soon bear his name, and when it did, no amount of impatience or whispers would be able to erase the sound of it. His grandson shifted uneasily in his seat, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor, betraying the nervous rhythm of his heart. The boy's eyes darted toward the stage, then back to his grandfather, filled not with love or pride, but with fear. Fear that the old man might speak, might be noticed, might somehow stain the family's carefully polished image. Leaning closer, his whisper came again, sharper this time, urgent. "Please, just stay quiet." The words did not strike like a command, but like a verdict. They pressed into the old man's chest, not because he felt unworthy, but because they revealed how his own blood wished to make him small. They did not fear his mistakes, they feared his existence. Shame burned through him, hotter than any humiliation he had known in youth, not because of what strangers thought, but because the people he had raised had reduced him to an embarrassment they wanted hidden behind silence. He looked down at his hands, those weathered, trembling hands that had once held this same grandson as a baby, rocking him through nights of fever, cradling him with tenderness that asked nothing in return. Those same hands had repaired bicycles, stitched torn jackets, and placed coins in small palms with a smile. Yet now, to this boy, they were nothing more than frail, embarrassing remnants of age. The old man lifted his eyes slightly and saw his son, his daughter-in-law, their postures stiff, their smiles frozen, glancing occasionally at him with a wordless warning. Stay in your place. It was not said aloud, but it was written in the tightness of their lips, in the narrowing of their eyes. They had rehearsed this evening as if it were a performance, and he was the one unpredictable actor they could not control. Better for him to be silent, invisible, erased. Shame pressed heavier than the ache in his knees, heavier than the weight of years bending his back. But this shame was not his. It belonged to them. He felt it seeping from their whispers, their glances, their fear. They carried the shame of being bound to a man they could not recognize as worthy, because they had traded gratitude for appearances, love for pride. And so they tried to bury him beneath their silence, hoping the world would never notice. The boy's whisper lingered, echoing like a chain. Just stay quiet. The old man sat still, but inside his spirit rose, for silence had been his companion all his life, through sacrifice, through struggle, through nights where his worth was counted not in words but in actions. He had never needed to shout to prove his dignity, and though his family begged him to shrink, he knew something they had forgotten. Silence is not weakness. Silence can thunder when the truth is ready to speak. He sat straighter in his chair, not with defiance but with quiet dignity, his chest heavy yet unbroken. The shame they tried to place upon him did not belong to him. It was theirs, and one day they would have to face it. For though they wanted him hidden, the world would soon remind them of who he truly was. The weight of their embarrassment would not crush him. It would one day crush them. The mayor stood tall at the podium, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of someone entrusted to name greatness. One by one, he spoke the names of men and women who had shaped the town, business leaders, teachers, philanthropists, veterans. Each name seemed to ripple through the air, each syllable greeted with reverent applause, as if the very sound of it added weight to the legacy behind it. Families leaned forward, proud and eager, their hands ready to clap as though applause could bind them to history itself. The old man sat still, his back bent, his hands folded quietly over his knees. He lowered his eyes, not out of humility but out of something heavier, resignation. His story, he told himself, had long been swallowed by silence. His name, once spoken with respect in the corners of town, had faded into obscurity with the passing years. He was not among those the mayor listed. His sacrifices had not been tallied, his contributions not carved into plaques. He had never asked for them to be. But hearing the names of others, celebrated and cheered, he felt the sharp reminder that no one here would call his. Around him, faces glowed with admiration. The crowd swelled with energy, their cheers growing with each recognition. His son clapped loudly, his daughter-in-law beamed, his grandson's eyes sparkled with excitement. But none of it was for him. For them, he was just an old man at the edge of the row, a shadow of a life too ordinary to be remembered. They did not know, perhaps they had chosen not to know, that much of what stood in this town had once been touched by his hands, lifted by his labor, preserved by his sacrifices. The walls, the roofs, the schools, the very streets they walked upon, had threads of his effort woven into them. Yet here, in this hall of polished pride, he was invisible. He listened as the mayor spoke of legacies, of visionaries who had given back to the community, who had shaped not just buildings, but futures. Each phrase cut a little deeper, for he knew the truth. He too had given. He too had shaped. He too had poured out pieces of his life into the fabric of this place. But he had done it without cameras, without microphones, without parades. He had done it when no one was watching, when recognition was the furthest thing from his mind. Still, the silence of his absence from the list was deafening. He thought of the years when he stood in the cold before dawn, hammer in hand, or when he turned over the last of his wages to pay for books his children could not afford. He thought of the times he had repaired, built, and labored, not for profit, but for the good of others, for the quiet pride of knowing someone else had a roof, a meal, a future. All of it was here, hidden in the marrow of this town, yet erased from memory. He lowered his eyes further, almost in shame, not of himself, but of the forgetting. He told himself that perhaps his story was not meant to be remembered. Perhaps the fate of those who build is to be buried beneath what they create, unseen while others stand taller in the glow of recognition. The thought ached in him, more painful than the stiffness in his bones. But beneath that ache, a deeper truth stirred, quiet and unshaken. Legacies do not vanish because they are unspoken. They live in the walls of buildings, in the laughter of children in schools, in the unseen foundation of a town that would not stand without them. And though he did not yet know it, the silence that wrapped around his name tonight would not last. For even the forgotten are remembered when truth decides it can no longer stay hidden. The mayor's voice, steady until now, faltered for the briefest moment. His hand, holding the stack of papers, trembled slightly under the glare of the lights. A hush fell across the hall, so sudden and heavy that even the air seemed to still. The applause from the last name faded, swallowed by expectation, by a silence that pressed on every chest. People leaned forward in their seats, eager for the next announcement, sensing that something different was about to unfold. At the end of the row, the old man felt his grandson's small hand tug at his sleeve, urgent, desperate. The boy's face had lost its glow of excitement, his eyes darting nervously between the mayor at the podium and the grandfather seated beside him. He feared something, though he could not yet name it. To him, silence meant safety, invisibility meant protection. He feared his grandfather might stand, speak, do something, anything, that would pull eyes toward them, eyes that judged without mercy. The old man did not move. His hands remained folded, his back bowed yet steady. But inside something stirred. It was not anger, nor was it pride. It was the quiet gravity of a moment long delayed, a truth waiting to step into the light. The hush in the hall grew unbearable, thick with anticipation. The boy's tugging became firmer, as if by sheer force he could anchor his grandfather in the shadows where the family wanted him to remain. The silence seemed to stretch on endlessly, each second heavier than the last. Faces in the crowd reflected unease, some whispering, some tilting their heads, waiting for the mayor to find his place again. And yet, that pause was not simply hesitation. It was the weight of history pressing through paper, the tremor of truth trying to surface after years of being buried. The old man lowered his eyes, unwilling to believe it yet, certain that this moment, too, would pass without him. For so long he had been invisible, a figure tolerated but never honored, present but never acknowledged. Why should tonight be different? And yet, deep within him, a flicker of something long forgotten rose, a strange certainty that the silence was not empty. It was a storm gathering, ready to break. His grandson's whisper came again, panicked, though softer this time, nearly pleading. "Please, just don't." The old man felt the words sink into him, sharp but hollow, the echo of fear not his own, but borrowed from those who had never learned the worth of silence, the dignity of waiting. Then the mayor cleared his throat, his voice slow, deliberate, as though he understood the weight of what he was about to say. The pause before the storm had ended, and with it, the fragile illusion his family had tried so hard to maintain was about to shatter. Then it came, clear, deliberate, undeniable. The mayor's voice cut through the thick silence like a bell tolling in the dead of night. "Would Mr. please join us on stage?" For a moment the hall seemed to exhale all at once, as if the entire room had been holding its breath. A wave of murmurs rose, gasps whispered through the crowd. Chairs creaked as heads turned sharply toward the end of the row where he sat. The old man did not move at first. His name, spoken with honor from the podium, felt almost unreal, as though he had imagined it. For years his presence had been something others endured, not celebrated. For years his silence had been mistaken for weakness, his sacrifices erased by forgetfulness, and yet here it was, his name carried on the lips of authority, spoken before the town, breaking the chains of invisibility that his own family had so carefully locked around him. Beside him, his grandson froze, his young face draining of color as though the very earth had shifted beneath him. The boy's lips parted, but no whisper came this time. Fear had silenced him, the fear not of embarrassment now, but of truth. He realized in that instant that the grandfather he wanted hidden had been called to the very center, the stage where only honor stood. The son stiffened in his chair, his knuckles tightening around the program in his hands. The daughter-in-law's painted smile faltered, her lips pressed tight as though she could swallow the moment whole. For all their efforts to push him into the shadows, the old man had been pulled into the light, not by defiance, but by recognition greater than any of them could deny. The hall stirred like a sea shifting under a storm. Strangers leaned in to see him, to measure the man whose name had been spoken. Some faces showed surprise, others admiration, and some guilt. Guilt for never noticing, for never remembering until the mayor's words forced them to. The sound of his name lingered in the air, stronger than the applause that followed, because it was not just a name, it was a story, a legacy, a truth returning to claim its place. Slowly the old man rose, his hands pressed against the arms of the chair, his body weary but steady. His cane tapped once against the polished floor, the sound echoing like a drum beat in the silence that followed. Each movement carried weight, not of frailty, but of dignity long denied. His head lifted, his eyes, dimmed by years but not broken, met the gaze of the hall. He did not rush, he did not stumble. He walked as though time itself had been waiting for him. The grandson lowered his eyes, unable to watch. Shame now belonged not to the man rising from the shadows, but to those who had tried to keep him there. The old man's heart ached, but not with sadness. It beat with a quiet, powerful truth. He had not been forgotten. His silence had not erased him. The world had spoken his name, and no whisper could bury it again. Step by step he rose, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders, yet unable to bend his spirit. The hall seemed to lean toward him, the silence stretching into eternity as his cane struck the polished floor with a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Each sound echoed louder than the applause that began hesitantly, building as realization spread through the crowd. He was not rushing, not faltering. Every step was deliberate. Every movement carried the weight of a life spent in sacrifice. This was no ordinary walk to a stage. It was a march back into the dignity they had tried to strip from him. The spotlight that moments ago illuminated strangers now fell across his bent figure, his worn suit, his weathered hands. Yet under its glow he did not appear small. He appeared monumental, like a tree that had stood through storms, scarred and bent but unbroken. The years had written themselves on his body, but in this walk those scars became symbols, each one a testament to survival, to endurance, to love given without expectation. Behind him, his family sank into their seats. Their bodies stiffened, their eyes lowered, their pride shriveled into disbelief. His son's face drained of color. His daughter-in-law's smile collapsed into a grimace, and his grandson sat frozen, staring at the floor as though it could swallow him whole. They had whispered for silence, begged for invisibility, but now the entire hall turned to look at the man they wanted hidden, and the light refused to let him go. The air carried a strange electricity, as though history itself had stopped to watch. Strangers began to clap louder, rising from their seats, their applause no longer hesitant but strong, insistent, a wave that swelled until the hall thundered. Each hand striking together was a recognition, each cheer a stone laid back into the foundation of his name. The more the crowd rose, the lower his family seemed to shrink, trapped in the cruel truth that the man they had called an embarrassment was being honored before them all. The old man did not look at them. His eyes were fixed on the stage, on the path ahead. He carried no anger in his face, no triumph, no gloating. What he carried was heavier, deeper, a calm dignity, a silent declaration that could not be erased. This was not revenge. It was vindication, pure and undeniable. As he moved forward, he thought of the nights he had walked home in the dark, tired but proud that his children would eat. He thought of the years his name had been spoken softly, sometimes dismissively, yet never with respect. And now, with every step, that name grew heavier, louder, filling the hall with a truth that silence could no longer contain. By the time he reached the stairs leading to the stage, the applause was no longer just noise. It was justice. And though his family trembled behind him, he felt only peace. For the long walk forward was not just his. It belonged to every sacrifice, every forgotten act of love, every invisible burden he had carried. Tonight, with each tap of his cane, dignity returned to its rightful place. The mayor's voice rang out across the hall, steady and resonant, carrying the weight of truth long overdue. "This man's contributions built the very foundation of our community," he declared, and the words seemed to strike the air like iron against stone. The applause quieted, as though every soul in the room needed to lean in, to listen. "Schools stand because of his generosity. Families thrive because of his labor. His name is written into the heart of this town." The old man stood at the center of the stage, the spotlight now his companion, not as an intruder, but as a crown. His shoulders, bent by years of toil, straightened as though the mayor's words themselves lifted them. His hands, rough and trembling, seemed steadier, his face weathered yet shining with a light that no age could dim. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Faces turned to one another in shock. Some gasped, some whispered his name with sudden recognition, piecing together memories they had once ignored. The worker who stayed late to finish a roof before the rain, the man who donated quietly to the school fund without leaving his name, the stranger who repaired playground equipment so children could laugh safely. Invisible threads of his life began to surface in their minds, and guilt bloomed in the silence between claps. The mayor continued, his voice firm but reverent. "For decades, he gave not for recognition, not for applause, but because he believed in us. When others sought reward, he sought only to build. His sacrifices were bricks in our foundations. His silence was not emptiness, it was strength. And today, it is time we speak his name, with the honor it deserves." The hall erupted, applause crashing like a wave, rising higher and stronger than before. People stood, some with tears in their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief at how they had overlooked him for so long. Strangers clapped with sincerity, while his family sat frozen in their seats, their faces pale, their pride shattered. The grandson's earlier whisper, "Don't embarrass us," now burned with shame, louder in memory than the thunderous applause. The old man did not gloat. He did not even smile. His eyes glistened, not with triumph, but with something deeper, a quiet grief mingled with peace. He had not needed this moment to know his worth. He had always carried it within him. Yet to hear it spoken aloud, to have it etched in the hearts of those who once looked past him, was a vindication that words could scarcely contain. For the first time in years, his name did not feel like a fading echo. It felt alive, written into the marrow of the town, carried on the voices of people who would never again forget it. And as the mayor's words lingered in the air, the old man stood taller, his silence no longer a burden, but a throne. His son lowered his head, unable to meet the eyes of those around him. The man who once carried himself with such pride, always eager to stand taller than others, now shrank into his chair as though the weight of his own arrogance was finally pressing him down. He had spent years dismissing his father as a relic of the past, a man better forgotten than remembered. Yet here, before the town, that same father was being honored, his name spoken with reverence while his own silence branded him guilty. Beside him, the daughter-in-law pressed her lips into a thin line, her face stiff with the strain of holding back emotions she could no longer mask. Her painted elegance cracked under the weight of truth. She had been the loudest in her disdain, the quickest to turn whispers into judgments, the one who perfected the art of pretending he was invisible. But now, as the applause swelled like thunder around her, her carefully built walls crumbled. Her shame was raw, sharper than any blade, cutting through the mask she wore for society's approval. The grandson sat frozen, wide-eyed, his breath caught in his throat. Just hours before, he had whispered, "Don't embarrass us," his words meant to cage his grandfather in silence. Now those words roared back in his memory, echoing against the mayor's speech, against the applause, against the undeniable truth standing under the spotlight. Shame burned hotter than any pride he had felt, searing into him with a clarity he could not escape. He had begged for invisibility, yet the whole hall now saw what he could not: a man of worth, of sacrifice, of legacy. The hall erupted in applause again, a standing ovation that rolled like waves through the crowd. People cheered with genuine admiration, strangers wiping tears from their eyes, neighbors nodding with newfound respect. But within his family's row, the clapping was faint, hesitant, forced. Their hands struck together softly, the sound of obligation rather than pride. It was as though they hoped to drown in the noise of others, to hide the truth of their own reluctance. Yet no matter how softly they clapped, their shame screamed louder than the crowd's thunder. The old man stood above it all, still and dignified, his face calm. He did not look down at his family. He did not need to. He knew what weighed on their hearts, and it was heavier than any years he had carried. Their shame was their burden now, just as his dignity was his crown. He had endured their whispers, their impatience, their erasure, and now, without lifting a finger, without raising his voice, he stood vindicated, while they sank beneath the weight of their own contempt. In that moment, it became clear to everyone in the hall. Respect had not been lost with age. It had only been hidden, waiting to be uncovered. And as the applause echoed on, the family who once feared embarrassment found themselves living it, not because of him, but because of their blindness, their arrogance, their failure to see the man who had given them everything. He stood silently beneath the lights, his figure outlined against the grandeur of the stage, yet he carried himself without pride, without vengeance. He did not need to gloat, did not need to turn and scold those who had silenced him for so long. His dignity stood taller than fury ever could. He had lived too many years, carried too many burdens, to waste this moment on bitterness. Justice had already spoken, not through his lips, but through the mayor's firm voice, through the thunderous applause of strangers who recognized what his own blood had refused to see. In that silence he became something larger than a man. He was the embodiment of quiet truth, revealed at last. Every wrinkle on his face was a line of history, every tremor in his hands a testimony of sacrifice. Yet none of it weakened him, it magnified him. He did not seek their apologies, for apologies could not return the years. He did not crave their admiration, for admiration now was too little too late. All he needed was what had already unfolded before him, truth made visible. The applause rose again, shaking the hall, echoing in every corner, filling every ear. People stood with sincerity, not because they had been told to, but because their hearts demanded it. Strangers saw in him what his family had chosen to forget, The labor that built their homes, the generosity that strengthened their schools, the endurance that preserved their community. He had never asked for thanks, yet now the thanks of an entire town rained down upon him and his family. They shrank deeper into their seats, crushed beneath the silence he had chosen. For his silence was not emptiness, it was thunder. It said everything their shame would not let them admit, that he had been worthy all along, that they had been blind, that their whispers of, "Don't embarrass us," had only revealed their own smallness. He did not need to point, to speak, to accuse. Justice lived in the contrast, the dignity of his calm against the trembling shame in their faces. He lowered his head gently, as though bowing not to the crowd, not even to the mayor, but to something greater, the truth itself. And in that bow there was no defeat, only the grace of a man who understood that time eventually uncovers what arrogance tries to bury. His silence, stronger than any speech, carried the final judgment. I was never less. I was always more than you chose to see. Justice had come, without fury, without vengeance, without cruelty. It had come clothed in applause and recognition, in the undeniable strength of truth finally spoken aloud. And as he stood in that storm of honor, the years of dismissal and whispers fell away, leaving behind only what could never be erased, his dignity, unshaken, unbroken, eternal. He bowed his head gently, a motion so small and humble, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. The applause swelled around him like a rising tide, voices and hands crashing together in recognition. But he did not stretch his arms wide to claim it, nor did he bask in triumph. He simply received it, as one receives sunlight on the skin, quietly, without demand, without hunger. His silence was not emptiness, it was a crown placed upon his head, unseen by some, undeniable to all. He did not turn to look at his family. He needed nothing from them, not their clapping hands, not their hurried apologies, not their trembling regret. Their shame was their own burden, their silence now the chain that bound them. For years they had tried to shrink him, to fold his life into the corners of their pride, to erase his name from the stage of memory. Yet here he stood, proof that dignity is never granted by those who betray it. It is carried within, unbreakable, unyielding. His worth had never depended on their acknowledgement, and in this moment, stripped of their arrogance, they could no longer deny it. The hall erupted once more, the standing ovation refusing to fade. Some wept openly, their tears falling not just for him, but for their own blindness. Others clapped until their palms stung, as though they could pour into this moment all the gratitude he had been denied. And there he stood, unmoving, calm, his bowed head shining with a grace that words could not describe. The silence he carried was thunder. It rolled heavier than shouts, louder than accusations, more piercing than any speech he could have made. It told a story that every heart in the room understood. Betrayal had tried to bury him, but truth had raised him higher than pride ever could. The boy who once whispered, "Don't embarrass us," could not raise his eyes. The son who had dismissed him could not lift his head. The daughter-in-law who had sneered at his presence clenched her fists in vain. They were chained not by him, but by themselves, and his silence thundered over them like a storm, reminding them that some legacies cannot be erased, some truths cannot be silenced, and some crowns are worn, not with jewels, but with quiet, undeniable dignity. And so he stood there, bowed yet tall, silent yet louder than any voice in the hall, wearing a crown no betrayal could tarnish. Years later, the story lived on, passed from lips that had not even been in that hall, carried like a torch from one generation to the next. It was not the whisper of shame that endured. No one remembered the boy's frightened plea, "Don't embarrass us." No one cared for the glances of impatience, the cold smiles, the dismissive sighs of those seated at the edge of pride. What people remembered, what children heard in classrooms, what neighbors repeated at gatherings, what strangers spoke with reverence, was the night the mayor called his name, and the hall rose to its feet. That was the moment that carved itself into memory, unerasable, undeniable. His name, once silenced in his own household, became a story told with honor. Teachers mentioned him when speaking of generosity, pointing to schools that stood because of his hands, because of his sacrifice. Town historians recalled how much of the community bore the imprint of his labor. Streets he had paved, roofs he had raised, projects he had quietly funded when others had turned away. Parents told their children of him not as a man of wealth or fame, but as a man of dignity, whose silence was stronger than thunder, whose worth outlasted the arrogance of those who had failed to see it. And in the quiet corners of his family's home, where once there had been only whispers of embarrassment, there now lingered something heavier: remorse. His son, who once lowered his head in shame, would spend the rest of his life recalling that night, remembering how he had sat in the shadows while strangers honored the father he had dismissed. The daughter-in-law, once so eager to erase him, carried the bitter memory of her tight lips in that hall, knowing that no mask could hide the truth that had outshone her pretense. And the grandson, the grandson, never forgot the words he had whispered in fear. They came back to him in dreams, echoing against the sound of applause, each time reminding him of the wound he had tried to place on the very man who had carried his future. That boy grew older, and he told the story differently. No longer a story of shame, but of redemption, of how a whisper had once tried to silence greatness, and how greatness had answered without a single word. The old man's name became more than a name. It became a symbol, spoken with respect that did not fade with time. On plaques, in records, in conversations, his legacy endured. It was not tied to wealth, though he had given generously. It was not tied to power, though his influence had quietly shaped the town. It was tied to something deeper, stronger: dignity in the face of betrayal, silence in the face of arrogance, patience until justice spoke for him. No one remembered the shoes he wore that night, or the way his cane tapped the floor, or even the expression on his family's faces as they shrank into their seats. What they remembered was the stillness of his figure beneath the lights, the calm of his bowed head, the roar of the hall rising in his honor. They remembered that when his name was spoken, the truth of a lifetime unfolded in a single breath. And so his story did not end in the shadows. It lived on as a crown, invisible yet eternal, placed not upon his head alone, but upon the generations that followed. A reminder carved into memory. Respect is not inherited, nor granted. It is earned, and once earned, it can never be erased. His grandson would never whisper, "Don't embarrass us," again. For in every retelling, in every corner of the town, in every child taught of his legacy, his very name itself had become the crown, undeniable, unerasable, eternal.